You're sitting in a classroom, your teacher is at the front. They're telling you that for most of history, people thought the Earth was flat, that Columbus was the brave one who proved them wrong, that medieval people were just too ignorant to figure it out. Here's the problem. Almost none of that is true. The idea that medieval people believed in a flat Earth is one of the most successful myths ever told. Not because the evidence supports it, but because a few people told the story convincingly enough, and it stuck. Historians of science have been correcting this for over 100 years. It keeps not mattering. So let's actually look at what medieval people believed, where the flat Earth story came from, and why you were probably taught something that scholars figured out was wrong before your grandparents were born. Start with the Greeks, because that's where the foundation is. By the 5th century BCE, educated thinkers had already concluded the Earth was a sphere. Empedocles argued it, Anaxagoras argued it. Aristotle laid out the case systematically in the 4th century BCE, pointing to two things you could actually observe. Ships disappear over the horizon hull first. During a lunar eclipse, the shadow Earth casts on the moon is always round. You don't need a telescope, you don't need calculus, you just need to look. And then around 240 BCE, a Greek polymath named Eratosthenes went further. He calculated the circumference of the Earth using 2 sticks, some shadows, and geometry. His answer came out to roughly 40,000 kilometers. The actual number is 40,075. That's not a rough guess. That's an extraordinarily precise calculation made more than 2,000 years ago. So what happened to all of that knowledge? Did it disappear when Rome fell? Did the church bury it? That's what the myth assumes. But here's where it gets interesting. The knowledge didn't disappear at all. It got copied, studied, and taught. Medieval scholars inherited Greek and Roman learning directly. Historians David Lindbergh and Ronald Numbers looked carefully at who in the Middle Ages actually denied the Earth was spherical. Their conclusion was blunt. There was scarcely a Christian scholar of the Middle Ages who did not acknowledge the Earth's sphericity. Not most of them. Scarcely any who didn't. Isidore of Seville included round diagrams of the Earth in his encyclopedic work in the early 7th century. Maps circulated alongside 5th century texts showed Earth divided into northern and southern hemispheres. Medieval universities taught Aristotle. They taught Ptolemy. The spherical Earth wasn't a secret, it was the standard curriculum. So where did the myth come from? The answer is surprisingly recent and surprisingly specific. In 1828, an American writer named Washington Irving published a biography of Christopher Columbus. It sounds like history. It wasn't. Irving invented a scene where Columbus stands before church officials who argue, using the Bible, that the Earth is flat. Columbus heroically disagrees. It's a great story. It also didn't happen. Columbus's opponents weren't arguing about the shape of the Earth. Everyone in the room already agreed it was round. The actual disagreement was about the size of the ocean and whether a ship could survive the crossing. Irving just made the flat Earth part up. That alone might have faded. But then in 1834, a French academic named Jean-Antoine Latronne published a work that misrepresented early church fathers as flat earth believers. A few years after that, an English philosopher named William Whewell pointed to 2 ancient writers, Lactantius and Cosmas Indicopleastes, as proof of medieval flat earth belief. Here's the part that's hard to take seriously once you know it. Lactantius wasn't a medieval thinker, he was an ancient one, and his flat earth views had already been mocked by other scholars for centuries. Copernicus specifically called him out in 1543 for speaking, quote, quite childishly about the Earth's shape. The examples used to prove medieval ignorance were ancient writers who had been ridiculed even in antiquity, and who had essentially no influence on mainstream medieval thought. Why did the myth spread so effectively anyway? Part of it is that it fit a narrative people wanted to believe. The idea that the Middle Ages were a dark period of religious superstition holding back scientific progress was useful for certain arguments in the 19th century. If you could paint medieval people as flat earth believers, you could contrast them with modern rational thinkers. It made a clean story. Clean stories spread. Messy corrections don't. The myth got picked up by popular writers, then by textbook authors, then by teachers who trusted the textbooks. Academic historians had been pushing back since at least 1920. That pushback mostly stayed inside academic journals, which is not where most people get their information. What you actually find when you look at medieval maps and manuscripts is something more complicated than either pure ignorance or pure knowledge. Medieval maps sometimes look strange to modern eyes. They're not oriented the way you'd expect. They mix geography with theology. But that doesn't mean the people making them thought the ground beneath their feet was a flat disk. Decorative and symbolic choices in art aren't the same as literal cosmological belief. Hieronymus Bosch painted a disc-shaped earth on the exterior of his triptych. That's a symbolic image in a piece of religious art, not a geography lesson. Here's what's actually remarkable about the Eratosthenes calculation specifically, because it deserves more attention than it usually gets. He was the chief librarian at Alexandria. He heard that in Syene, a city to the south, the sun at noon on the summer solstice cast no shadow at all. The sun was directly overhead. In Alexandria, on the same day, a vertical stick cast a clear shadow. He measured the angle of that shadow. He knew the distance between the two cities. From those two pieces of information, he worked out the full circumference of a sphere. His answer was within a fraction of a percent of the modern measurement. That method, that result, was studied and recorded and passed forward. Ptolemy used it. Medieval scholars read Ptolemy. The chain of knowledge didn't break. It just got complicated by the time it reached popular culture in the 19th century, when someone decided it was better to rewrite the story entirely. Medieval scholars weren't guessing about the shape of the earth. They weren't bravely defying church dogma to admit it was round. They weren't struggling against a flat earth consensus. They were sitting in universities reading Aristotle's proofs and Ptolemy's maps and Eratosthenes' calculation, mostly agreeing with all of it, and moving on to argue about other things entirely.